Hi, another Mrs. H Psychology revision video. Again, this is for paper 3 for the addiction topic, explaining nicotine addiction. And this time it's video 2 for this, which is learning theory, including cue reactivity. And there's some references of the textbooks that we use. So I'm going to show you a mind map and talk you through that for this. This is what the end result will look like on the mind map. But I'm now going to zoom in on different areas, starting with operant conditioning. So remember that operant conditioning deals with positive and negative reinforcement. With positive reinforcement, with both types of reinforcement, you're always strengthening the behaviour. In other words, you are always increasing the chances, the likelihood of that behaviour occurring again. Okay, so we have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is achieving something nice, which will strengthen the behaviour, and negative is taking away something aversive, something negative, something unpleasant, but still strengthening the behaviour. So let's talk positive reinforcement first of all. Remember that nicotine is rewarding on our brain effectively. It has positive effects with dopamine. So the dopamine will increase our alertness. It gives us mild euphoria, makes us feel more relaxed. So obviously if we are having those effects, that is going to make us feel better, and therefore we are definitely getting a positively reinforced effect from that, and that is likely to strengthen our behaviour. So this positive effect could explain initial trials with it and the very early stages, that people might want to have that same effect repeated, and therefore they may go on to smoke again. Okay, so the positive reinforcement are the effects of the dopamine in the brain. They are rewarding, as explained. So let's go on to talk about negative reinforcement. As already mentioned, what we get are withdrawal effects if we haven't been taking the substance. So if we haven't been smoking, somebody's going to have increased agitation, they'll have worse concentration, mood swings like anxiety, increased anxiety, possibly depression. They won't have that euphoric feeling, and therefore they're going to have negative effects. So these withdrawal effects. So what will happen is they're going to try to avoid those. So they will then go on to smoke to avoid those. They'll learn to anticipate the symptoms and the effects of withdrawal, and therefore go and have a cigarette to try and avoid that. Or we could also have the other negative reinforcing factor of escape learning, where they get the negative side effects and then they have learned how to reduce those by having another cigarette. So we can have avoidance learning and escape learning, both types of negative reinforcement. Remember, negative reinforcement, aversive, unpleasant effects, and therefore one has learnt to avoid those unpleasant effects by doing a specific behaviour. So this would explain very nicely why people might continue to smoke. All right, so continuation of smoking. So those are our explanations in terms of operant conditioning. Here we want to have a look at a piece of research, and the research we're going to look at is the Level research. So let's have a look at this. 11 used rats, in this case, a piece of research 2010, trained rats to self-administer doses of nicotine by licking either one of 2 different water spouts to give themselves a self-dose of nicotine. And what they found was this behaviour increased with every training session, up to 100 licks per infusion. And therefore the idea was they were getting the effects of nicotine and being positively reinforced for this behaviour of self-administering themselves with nicotine. And because that was happening in these rats with Levin's research, that suggests that the same sort of principles would be applied to, or would be occurring with humans as well. Now, obviously, a clear evaluative point is the fact that we're limited in generalizing from animals to humans, particularly here because we know with humans we have a lot more social factors that will also be influencing, and we'll discuss those in a moment. But social and cognitive factors, the fact of social norms, peer groups, peer pressure, for example, also playing a role here. So we can evaluate in terms of that. So let's go on now and have a look at social learning theory as another explanation. Okay, so with social learning theory, we should always outline the key terms. We know that we need to be saying that with social learning theory, we observe role models and we imitate them, we copy, but there are mediating factors that come between the observation and the copying of the behaviour. For example, our motivation to copy. We also have other key terms such as vicarious or vicarious learning. So we learn indirectly from watching other people and the consequences of their behaviour. And social learning theory really offers a very good explanation for why people might, particularly young people, might start smoking in the first place, that initiation into smoking. Right, so applied to nicotine, there may be normative influence, so peer group, peer pressure, perceived norms that, you know, that it's cool, or that particular group in school are perceived as, you know, as quite cool, and they're the ones who are smoking. There may be actual social pressure as well. There may be media that plays a role, for example. So there are these social pressures that can be used here to explain the link between social learning and smoking. And if we look at the research, we've got research by Brunner. For example, Brunner found that media images of people smoking create perceptions of being very attractive, very tough, and that may increase motivation for particularly young people, vulnerable people wanting to smoke. And obviously we have role models in the media who smoke, and those are important. We know that they play a massive role in the way that children look up to these models, want to be like them, and therefore they are very influential for them. We know that there are gender differences as well. For example, Carpenter found that young females were more sensitive to smoking, and so there are these gender differences as well, and females more likely to smoke than males initially. And just evaluation, social learning theory is a really good explanation for why, as I already mentioned, why young people might initiate themselves into smoking, why they might start smoking in the first place. But the spec wants us to talk about cue reactivity as well, so we need to bring in classical conditioning. So let's have a look at classical conditioning now, a lot more detail with this. So what you would need to start with is the basic outline of classical conditioning. And here it's worth us putting in the diagram UCS to UCR, so unconditioned stimulus to unconditioned response. So we know that nicotine will have an effect on dopamine, so the dopamine is therefore going to make us feel better. So nicotine will lead to increased dopamine, which is going to have a positive effect, for example, in making us feel a little bit more euphoric, less anxious, etc. And then the neutral stimulus would be the cigarette. So we're learning an association between the cigarette and that response. Okay, so we are learning these associations. And any cues that we associate with that cigarette and with those experiences are going to then go on with higher order conditioning to act as triggers. So what could those cues be? Well, they could be anything that somebody has learned. So for example, if a young person's smoking at school, it might be the people that they're going with, would be an association, or a particular location, you know, behind the bike shed or wherever it is. If it's somebody who's smoking whenever they're in the pub, so it may be the particular pub or ashtrays, for example. It could be having a drink. There's a learned association that they're going to have a cigarette every time they have a drink, or a particular setting, seeing certain ashtrays, seeing certain lighters. There could be a number of different cues for them, and those cues will be a trigger to want to have a cigarette. So they've learned this association between these cues and needing a cigarette. And obviously all those cues then make it very difficult for them to finish smoking, to cease smoking, because those cues also react as a trigger for them. And that would help to explain continuation of smoking, because there are all these cues around them. So a piece of research to support this comes from Carter and Tiffany. This was a meta-analysis of 41 studies. And what they did was they showed dependent and non-dependent smokers different cues, and they also had a control group of non-smokers. Showed them different cues, for example, lighters and ashtrays, etc., etc. And they assessed them by using self-reports in terms of their desire for a cigarette, and also physiological assessments like their heart rate as a more controlled assessment. And what they found was that those who were more dependent reacted much more strongly to those cues. So they had high cravings, for example, as opposed to those who are less dependent. And we can also use an evaluator point for this, because we know that classical conditioning goes on, that we learn these associations. Obviously, we've got a real life application here, and we can try to counter condition people to help them stop smoking. So, for example, James Smith's research with participants, giving them, they basically learned to give themselves small electric shocks when they engaged in smoking related behaviours. And so these were pretty painful, but they were self-administered. And so the idea being that they were learning an aversive stimulus with that pleasurable experience of smoking. So to try to stop them having a pleasurable association with it. What they found was after a year, 52% had managed to abstain from smoking. And obviously that's a significantly higher result or improvement on the roughly 20 to 25% of people who managed to abstain just by deciding to give up. So it seemed to be an effective treatment. So we could also link that in. And in terms of other evaluation for learning theory, we can comment on these three. So first of all, there seems to be plenty of research to support the idea that social learning theory, as one of these learning theories, social learning theory is important in terms of initiation, starting smoking, and that conditioning in different ways is also important for maintaining it. So, for example, operant conditioning with positive and negative reinforcement. So it does seem to provide good explanations for different aspects of smoking. However, it is a little bit limited because the individual needs to have some sort of motivation, want to smoke, and we know that we have 50% of people who, you know, are able to give up smoking relatively easily, according to some research. Chippers who can smoke some of the time but give up when they want to. And we've also, so, you know, we could say there are other factors. It's not just learning theory. There are really other factors that come into play, and big important cognitive factors as well as possibly biological. We've also got the fact that some of this research is based on animals, and we've already talked about the limitations of that. So then the next videos that you would be looking at are the explanations for gambling addiction. So learning theory and cognitive theories on separate videos.